Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes just for people to log on. So if you could just bear with us for a couple of minutes and then we'll start the webinar very shortly. Thank you.
So Mark, I think you're on presenter view, so it's not sure if that's best to show the full screen instead.
Sherry, is that better?
Yeah, but I don't think you have shared your full screen. So if you can share full screen, let's try that.
How's that?
Yes, it's loading. Yes, it works now with full screen. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Well, I can see that we've got quite a few people online now, so we'll kick off. And apologies for the slight technical glitch there with my presenting skills, which is always a great irony when presenting around the technology sector, but there we go. So first of all, I'd like to welcome everyone who's joining today for this session of the UK-China Tech Forum. For those of you that haven't joined before, the Tech Forum is jointly hosted by the China-Britain Business Council and techUK as a platform to allow businesses to engage with stakeholders across business and government, focusing on important areas of UK-China technology trade, policy and market opportunities in both countries. So we welcome you here today. And unfortunately, my colleague at techUK, Yana Saka, has gone down with a bit of a bug this morning, so she's unable to join us. So I'll be moderating today's session, but I know Yana is listening in to the session and will be happy to kind of take any questions for techUK that come up. And I know that techUK and CBBC are very closely aligned in terms of our position on the UK-China opportunities and the challenges for technology businesses, which I'm sure we'll get into shortly. So I think it's probably something of an understatement to say that 2022 has been a challenging year for businesses globally. And I think the China tech sector in particular has had a particularly torrid year. If we go back to the beginning of the year, I think we started 2022 with the invasion of Ukraine, the global energy crisis, In China, Shanghai had a protracted lockdown at the beginning of the year. And then I think pretty much every major city in China experienced repeated lockdowns throughout the year, really impacting on business, particularly international business. And still today, there are restrictions prevent, quarantine restrictions in place that make traveling to China a little bit cumbersome for companies in the UK. It's also the year that China really began regulating the tech sector quite heavily. So, we saw a number of large Chinese technology companies receive fines relating to antitrust and data privacy legislation. And then, of course, there's the US-China relationship, the so-called decoupling, which has really impacted the technology sector more than any other. More Chinese entities added, Chinese companies added to the US entities list, new export controls, and particularly in the area of chips and semiconductor, this is really beginning to impact, have a global impact, and not just on China and the US. It clearly also impacts our industries here, and it has an impact on supply chains and so on. So you might wonder why any UK business would even think about going into China and sort of having a trading strategy for China, given some of these challenges. If you look at the UK government's own export strategy, it's clear that the Indo-Pacific already accounts for over 50% of global growth. And actually, in terms of the APAC region, China is by far the largest single economy, accounting for around half of GDP. And it's a market that is increasingly digitized. The digital economy already accounts for 40% of GDP, and pretty much whichever sector you're looking at, whether it's telecoms, 5G, mobile, artificial intelligence, all these areas, China is a global leader. And the fact that China is still expected to become the largest global economy, within the next decade, suggests that it's an opportunity, and it's a market that businesses just can't afford to ignore. So the UK, itself has experienced a challenging year economically and politically, and growth seems to be the big watchword here. And clearly, exports is going to, and investment is going to play a key role in that. So as we shift to reposition ourselves as a global science and technology superpower, collaboration and competition with China is inevitable. And I think those are almost the two themes I think that perhaps we'll talk about today. How we can both work with China and compete with China. And of course, these things are going to be vital to other objectives, such as achieving net zero by the middle of the century. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our panelists today. Today's session is really a review of, the current landscape for businesses in China. So we're very fortunate to have three experts from that are currently based in China. So we have we're very fortunate to have Trevor Lewis, the Director for Innovation and Industry at DIT, based in Guangzhou. Sherry Pan, the head of tech, working very closely with Trevor, also based in Guangzhou, and Jonathan Dove, who is the Market Access Manager, focusing on policy issues, located in Beijing. So I think we're going to hand over. Sherry, I'm going to pass to you for the next section, because I think you've got some slides to share. So I will stop sharing my slides, and if you want to bring yours up, That'd be great. Just for anyone joining the session, so we've got this, the event today is in webinar mode. So if you have any questions as we go through, feel free to use the Q&A function, the chat box, just to ask any questions that you have. We will have plenty of time at the end of the session to for some Q&A, and what we'll do is we'll bring people in if you want to speak and say a few words, share your views, share your experiences, any questions that you have, then that'd be an ideal time for that. But without further ado, I'll pass over to Sherry for the first presentation.
Sure. Just to check, you can see my screen, Mark and Trevor.
Yeah, if you could just maximize the slide view, that'd be great.
Sure. So I will turn off my camera. So over to Trevor first.
Okay, great. Thanks very much indeed, Sherry. So hopefully the slides will come up in full screen in a minute. There we are. And if you'd kindly go over to the first slide, please, Sherry, that's great. Should be coming up. Well, there we go. I know, and that's where I really wanted to start with China Matters. But first, I'd just like to thank CBBC and techUK for putting on this webinar today. Much appreciated, and good timing. And you'll see my first point there is very much that China matters. Mark very kindly reminded us of how difficult the last few years have been, and they really have been very, very difficult. And I think during that time, particularly 3 years of COVID in China, where China has largely been closed off, then we worry slightly that some UK companies who might otherwise have been looking at China have decided it's all too difficult. Well, hopefully we're getting beyond that now, and we're getting into a phase with reopening where we want to see British companies coming back to the Chinese market, and that's why we're keen to do events like this, just to encourage you to start thinking about China again. We haven't fully developed our plans yet, but we're hoping to be able to do something around the London Tech Week, which I think is in June. So hopefully we might meet up with some of you in person then. Just in terms of why it matters, of course, I don't think people can ignore the second largest economy in the world. It's interesting, when I served in China and Shanghai about 20 years ago, and we used to talk then about a population of 1.3 billion people, 300 million of which were considered to be middle class, who had aspirations and money to spend on products. Coming back 20 years ago, we're now talking about 1.4 billion people, 400 million or so have got that spending power. So that's the growth in those 20 years of a population, I think, roughly the size of Turkey. So when you think about the size of the Chinese market, I think that puts it into a little bit of context, how fast it's grown. I think it's also worth noting there that the Chinese market from when I was here 20 years ago has changed a bit from a market that was very much about foreign investors coming in to manufacture in China with the view to then exporting to other parts of the world, but very much to a market that is manufacturing within China still, but for the Chinese population. And as I just mentioned, that's a huge population. So don't be particularly put off by lots of stories about companies, moving their supply chains elsewhere. That's obviously happening, but what's also happening in the meantime is that Chinese companies are building up much more of a domestic market. So I think that's where we're going to be headed. And it's a very young and tech savvy market as well. I've been astounded by coming back here that pretty much everyone lives their entire life on a mobile phone. Everything seems to be on there, from your money to your shopping, online shopping. Someone joked with me before about China. Those of you who haven't been here recently, or in some cases perhaps not at all, but in the big cities, someone said to me that's the only place that they've ever been where you can literally order one onion online and it'll be delivered to your accommodation sort of within 15 and 20 minutes. So I haven't been quite as extravagant as just ordering one onion, but when I do some of the online shopping, it really is here, literally ordered and paid for online and then delivered within sort of a few minutes, with the delivery driver then phoning you just to confirm it's been dropped off. So it's really working. And again, the sad thing about that is you'll often see groups of particularly young Chinese people, 4 or 5 around a table, none of whom are actually talking to each other, all of whom are on their mobile phones. I think that's probably true of other parts of the world, but it's certainly noticeable here. And then just going through the particular points below that, obviously the fourth largest trading partner globally, and certainly, as Mark mentioned, our largest trading partner in Asia. And that's going to continue despite some of the challenges. So 2019, obviously the overall market got up to £100 billion for the first time. That's obviously slipped back a little bit due to COVID, but I think it will start to come back up again. And I just did some research this week just on our latest figures, which show that sort of, UK exports of goods, as it says below, is 7% up in the period to 2022 over last year. So that suggests to me, I mean, it's not a long period to have a trend, but it suggests to me that that trend is beginning to move in the right direction. Sixth largest export market and fourth largest trading partner. So again, that gets back to my point at the beginning that China matters, and China matters to us. And the UK is a top destination in Europe for Chinese FDI. And we have seen a pickup, an uptick in Chinese tech companies going to the UK. Not as many as we'd like to see, I think, and there are reasons for that, obviously, but I think what we will hope to see is more Chinese companies going to the UK. We think the UK is a great base, not just for the UK, but indeed into Europe. And I think Chinese companies who are there find the UK a good place to operate. So we're going to do a lot more to try and attract more Chinese companies there. We're speaking to quite a few. We have a pipeline, but obviously for companies getting out of China and getting back in, it's been a bit difficult. But I hope we'll see more of that in due course. So certainly another priority for us. Don't want to spend too much time on the politics today because obviously we want to get into the more detailed tech stuff. But around the politics, it was very much the fact that you'll see the note before that UK's moved on to a relationship of robust pragmatism with China. The Foreign Secretary made a speech earlier this week about this, which again mentioned China. But I think there's been a slight softening. Those of you China watchers will have noted that certainly under the Liz Truss Prime Ministership, she was very much referring to China as a threat since the new Prime Minister's come in. And so we've moved to a phase of robust pragmatism, which is certainly a softening of that. We'll just have to see how that develops over the next couple of years. Shifting market, I mentioned that's just very much around what I was saying, that it's become a domestic market more than a manufacturing base. And I think it's certainly true, speaking to the few companies, because unfortunately due to COVID, I've not been able to get out and see as many companies as I would have liked to have done over the last couple of months. But it's quite clear from the ones that I do speak to that they still like the UK. They respect the British way of life and our products and our services. So I think there's a good platform to build on from there. So the next slide, please, Sherry. Take it is coming. We'll just hopefully there. Yeah, great. Yeah, COVID. I won't go into too much detail about that. You read the points there, but obviously it's been a rapid change in the COVID situation really over the last couple of weeks. You will have been aware from certainly those who've got access to the news channels about some of the protests. Whether that was the reason for it, I'm not entirely sure. It certainly had an impact, and there's been a huge change. I know just from colleagues here that we've now got colleagues in the office who've got COVID. I know colleagues in the embassy in Beijing, quite a few people there have picked up COVID. So as the controls have been relaxed, then not surprisingly, there's been a big wave of COVID infections. And that is certainly having an impact at the moment. If I look out on the streets, they are quite quiet still. And a lot of people are very nervous about that. But I think, as we had in the UK, we have to get over this wave. People will sadly get infected. But once people get more familiar and more comfortable with the fact that certainly the latest strain is quite mild, and that for the vast majority of people it will be cold flu-like symptoms and they can move on, then I think the economy will really start to open up again. But certainly a big change. There's a risk, I guess, that there could be a U-turn, but I think that would be far too difficult now because it's got to a stage where we've really sort of, let COVID dice roll to a certain extent in China. And I think now that's happening and more people will get infected. But once people have got used to the infections and got over it, then hopefully things will start to get back much more to normal. One thing that hasn't been lifted yet, I think, or very much is international travel. But I would hope for those of you who want to come to China, visit your businesses who haven't been able to do it perhaps for quite some while, that you should be able to do so. I would think in the next 3 to 6 months. Difficult to say, but I can't see there's a way that won't happen in the next few months. Next slide, please, Sherry. this was I think last week the British Sentiment Survey came out. So this is British businesses based here. You can read there what they highlighted as issues. Not too surprising, I guess. A lot of it was around COVID. I think the issue around employing foreign staff was very much about getting staff in and staff out, getting your sales manager over, getting your sales director in, that type of thing. So not too surprising that COVID was an issue there. And then obviously the final one there, number 3, navigating cybersecurity and IT regulations. And we'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a minute. So next slide, please, Sherry. Yeah. Again, rather than go through all of these point by point, I'll let you read those on the slide. But you can see, I mean, certainly the sort of ambition to be a tech superpower by 2035, and just the size of the market, you know, $800 billion in 2022. So, you know, huge market. And lots of commitments in the 14th 5-year plan, which you can sort of see there. The trend, if you look at the points there, the trend is very much more towards self-reliance. I think this is obviously in reaction to the US tech curves, but that's definitely the way they want to go. So you'll see through those points, investment and development are key priorities. I guess in a way that for some of you looking to export to China, that might be a risk over time, in the sense that obviously as the Chinese market develops and becomes more self-sufficient, then the demand for some of the products will sort of, you know, ease off a bit. But having said that, it seems to me also that the 2035 target is probably a little bit ambitious now, given that COVID will have knocked them back a bit. And even then, so if you push that back a couple of years, there's 15 years there, during which time I think Chinese companies will be very reliant upon getting the technology from elsewhere to help them sort of beef up their own industry. So I think the market's still going to be very robust for exporters, and particularly for those who've got products which China isn't yet able to match themselves. So I think that's important. The electric vehicles point at the very bottom is an interesting one, because again, coming back 20 years on from when I was last here, the fact that there's a lot more electric cars is one thing, but there's also a huge number of electric scooters. When I was in Shanghai, if you pulled up at a set of traffic lights, you know, within sort of, you know, 30 seconds, you would be surrounded by dozens and dozens of people on push bikes. Now it's the same problem, but pretty much everybody now is on an electric scooter. And certainly Chinese companies are investing in the UK and exporting their cars. So Lotus are building and manufacturing an electric car here, which then goes to the UK. But there's a big push within the electric car industry for these vehicles to become more and more connected, IT connected. So that's going to be a huge growth. So I think in terms of developing the cars themselves, there's been huge strides, but actually what comes next, I think, is very much around, you know, how those cars are then connected. Not just in terms of your day-to-day life, but in terms of autonomous vehicles, etc. So that's definitely going to be a trend where China is going to be very much at the cutting edge. Next slide, please, Sherry. Definitely got a lag. Yeah, I think I was pretty sure that was the next slide anyway. So yeah, just in terms of risks to consider for those of you, I think actually to a certain extent the legal and the commercial ones come together. I think very much what people will need to do, and most of you are already doing this, I'm sure, but is be very careful about, you know, your contracts. Make sure that everything you're doing in China is watertight, cleared not just with your own lawyers, but with Chinese-based lawyers as well, who can look at the fine print and make sure it's there. Certainly, again, from 20 years ago, I think there was the Chinese protection of intellectual property in particular was very lax. Now, not to say it's perfect now, but it's certainly a lot better now than it was there. And I think part of that goes back to what I was saying earlier on about China developing its own products and services. So, of course, the risk now is not just to foreign companies bringing intellectual property over here, but as the risk has grown for Chinese companies themselves, then obviously they've been very keen to protect that. And then you'll see that website there. I think we are going to Mark can confirm later on, but we are going to share the slides later on. So if you want to click on that link when you've got it, if you can't write it down now, then we'll share that link with you later on, and that will give you a lot more advice and sort of specific instructions on the sector. I think I'm handing over to you now, Sherry.
Thank you, Trevor. I'm sorry about latency. I think there's kind of 5 seconds latency.
Just to let you know, we can see the slides immediately as soon as you change them, so you don't need to wait. Sure.
That's actually, is relevant to my content. So why digital infrastructure is very important. And in the next 10 to 12 minutes, I will share, my observation and also team's observation on China's tech trends, China's digital economy, and hopes that gives you a flavor of, what has been going on and what should be looking forward to. So this is actually more for UK-based companies who want to go to China, given the international travel has been resumed. First of all, sharing 2 of the buzzwords, which is my favorite. Digital infrastructure, new digital infrastructure, and also digital transformation. So starting from the first buzzword catchphrase, new digital infrastructure. So this is not new to a lot of you, I assume, which was becoming a buzzword back from 2018. So again, there's no doubt, China is the biggest, 5G and IoT market with the massive deployments in terms of data centers, 5G, network, as well as IoT connections. It's also what's to mention, China is also building up a vast majority network for internet vehicles. If you're looking at kind of, the new energy vehicle charging power numbers back in 2021 last year. So the number reached to 2.6 million with a 56% of growth rate, compared to 2020. So it's happening. So why, digital infrastructure is so important? It's basically served as the stimulator for China's continuing GDP growth. It also serves as a foundation and base for China to upgrade its manufacturing supply chain from low end to high end. So it is critically important for China's development in the next 5 to 10 years. The second kind of catchphrase I'd like to mention is digital transformation. So, the terminology I listed here is quite confusing. So for Western audience, so I will explain that, for example, when we're talking about industrial digitalization, 产业数字化 is easy to understand, is using tech as an enabler to combine digital economy and the real economy together, transfer vertical. So that is reflect international standards. So we also, proposed by Chinese government to also have terminology, which is digital industrialization. So what actually that means? That means commercialize scientific findings and scientific results as economic drive to create and boost new emerging sectors and new industries. So these actually are 2 key pillars under this kind of, a digital transformation wave. And also share with you a set of figures which you can see in the right side of the screen. So this is the prediction by IDC, a think tank in China. So they have shared kind of the figures for predictions in the next 5 years. For example, pick one, the number of technology manufacturers in China, in China's top 500 enterprises will double. So, now we have like Huawei, Tencent in top 500 list, but, in the next 5 years or so, we'll see, companies from other sectors outside of tech industry will be join the list. For example, could be companies from utility sectors or retailer sectors as well. Another figure, under the backdrop of, the 2 buzzwords. So I'll actually share with you the China's digitalization index in a map format. So this map is produced by Tencent Research Institute, basically captured kind of digital transformation penetration rate across China. So the benchmark are the digital infrastructure, kind of deployments, the benchmarks including the number of digital applications and also the number of digital platforms. So combined together, they come up with an index map. So if we look at this map, the dark blue bit, slightly dark blue represents higher penetration or higher level of adaptance in terms of digital transformation, where we can see, the coastal city, East China, have been doing better than the West China. And also what's to mention, the digitalization of 11 major city clusters represents 80% of China's digital economy. So I've mentioned, and actually I've picked up some clusters for reference. If you have been to China, you must be very familiar with those cities, that including, for example, Pearl River Delta. We call that GBA these days, which contains Shenzhen and Guangzhou. It includes Jing-Jin-Ji, which includes, like cities of Beijing and Tianjin as well. So these are the key players. Also to share, another interesting finding is in terms of digital transformation is actually very much, it's spreading very fast from east to west. And you can see kind of, the purple circle. That is kind of the center of China's massive digital infrastructure projects called East Data Processing in the West. So Dongshu Xisuan, the company joined, from online from China side, they'll be very familiar. So this is very much a super infrastructure projects initialized by Chinese governments and DRC back in this March. The initiative is to build 8 national data computing hubs and 10 national data center clusters in Western provinces, in likes of Chengdu, in Sichuan provinces, in Ningxia, in Gansu, etc., to reduce the energy pressure in the coastal cities, in those smart industries, and use renewable energy in the Western provinces to optimize energy efficiency. So this is actually where the money would go in the coming years. And also to share with you, reflect what have been said in the last 2 slides in terms of, how digitalized each provinces and cities are. Again, the top 10 are coming from, the likes of Guangdong, #1, and Beijing, Shanghai. And well, those cities and provinces who is catching up with almost 3 digits growth rate are coming from Central and West China, like Guizhou, Hunan, Henan are growing very fast and invest a lot in whole concept. And also to mention, number of verticals we're looking at, people like to look at, how digitalized each industry are. So again, and the left map is kind of, is kind of definition by market size. It's not surprising, similar like UK, the likes of, ICT, financial service industry, of course, those are most digitalized sectors. But what I want to highlight here is the manufacturing space. And this is actually, if you look at, finance, e-commerce, entertainment, they're almost like digital native industry, but manufacturing is on the top in terms of, real economy, and also, combined with healthcare, enjoys almost a 3-digit growth rate, compared to previous years. I have to say, China, of course, like to invest in manufacture. China alone is the world, the manufacturing hub, and also, China produce 30% of global goods. And of course, it's important, but it's not necessarily all the Chinese manufacturers are trying to embrace digital technologies. You got, good players, automobile brands, ICT equipment companies, they're like to, putting automation as the top priority. But you also got, followers, companies in pharmaceutical industry, companies in oil and gas, they're looking at catching up. And of course, you have a bunch of companies based in somewhere, who are still recording their purchasement quarter and sales figure on spreadsheet. So that actually means, that's a vast majority market we can look at that presents a long-term challenge and also a long-term opportunity for domestic and international players. And also take a specific look in terms of the manufacturing sector. So this is actually a table of how China is adopting digital technologies in the life cycle of manufacturing process, very much from the production design, production, as well as sales and management operation process. It's not easy to tell. So if you look at the kind of the table here, we can tell in terms of adoption and choices. Apparently, the later stage, especially in sales, marketing, logistics, payments, they have a much better deployment rates and adoption rates in that space. But also, where we see kind of potential growth is actually sit in the early stage, in the production and production design stage. Especially, people are estimating, the growth will be light in the likes of AI quality inspection, will be seated in MES, which is the manufacturing execution systems. So again, that represents opportunities for domestic and international players. Last one on manufacturing, just example. So this is actually a beautiful table of logos, which is basically the value chain of digital manufacturing suppliers in China. You could pick up, familiar names, Huawei, Tencent, Alibaba, and also international names like Oracle, SAP, or Honeywell. So again, this is created by iResearch. 2 points from me. First of all, this is not necessarily, competitors. So this is, can you still hear me? Sorry.
Yeah, we can hear you, but you're jumping around a bit on the slides.
Okay, sure. So again, the first point I want to make is these are not necessarily your competitors. They are, a lot of them are system integrators who would want to working with international partners, knowledge providers like yourself, to provide bespoke solutions for manufacturing industry. And second point to make is, we do have, UK players in the space, just not on this map. For example, in the software layer, we have been working with likes of, Viva, Micro Focus, Sage on providing support and pointing them to the right government stakeholders and project owners, across the country. So again, we're doing a lot in this. Last but not least, in terms of what we can do, again, Trevor mentioned, the international travel, and actually, China has remained quiet for the past 3 years in terms of international travel. So what we want to invite, is actually for Chinese company and UK companies to join us, is to, looking forward to our events in 2023, which including MAC events, in China, bring missions to the cities of, Fuzhou, Tianjin, or Chongqing. That's including, bespoke roadshows targeting as specific themes, green consumer tech. That's also including specific, outbound missions going to the UK, bring Chinese company going to London Tech Week. So this is kind of, where we want to work with you if you're interested to catch up afterwards. Last but not least, we have been building, digital transformation portfolio. I've been speaking lots about it, and some companies have signed up, and this is ongoing digital platform. And if any of companies interested in joining, from UK side, welcome to get in touch with us and afterwards. So I'll pause here. I've been speaking enough. I'll pause and hand over to my colleague Jonathan to talk about, regulations on data and other areas. Jonathan, back to you.
Thanks very much, Sherry. Pleasure to be here, and thanks everybody for coming on the line today. So my segment will cover China's data regulations. So data remains a key area of focus for foreign companies doing business in China. A recent survey of UK businesses in China showed that they remain one of the key challenges that they're facing. So in sum, China is developing its own approach to data governance. And over the last year or so, we've seen some important laws come into place. This includes the data security law and the personal information protection law from last year. And together with the cybersecurity law in 2017, this forms the foundation of China's framework for data governance. And so with that in place, we're now seeing some more detailed rules and implementing regulations come into force. So I will cover some of what's come into force in the last year or so. But just to quickly note that China's data landscape is quite detailed and complex. So today's presentation isn't meant as a comprehensive overview, but can hopefully give attendees some useful takeaways and a general flavor of China's regime. Next slide, Sherry, please. I'm not sure if the slides come up for everyone else, but oh, it's come up. Thanks, Sherry. So one of the areas I wanted to cover was the data privacy landscape. So last year, China implemented its own data privacy law called the PIPL. So now, similar to the UK and Europe, China has its very own dedicated privacy law, which covers the entire life cycle of personal information processing. It does, in good news for UK and EU companies, it bears quite a strong resemblance to the GDPR in some areas. This includes the definition of personal information and what it means to process personal information. Similar to GDPR, the PIPL also has extraterritorial effect. So under certain conditions, the processing of personal information abroad, the PIPL will still apply. Another area of similarity is that the PIPL sets out various legal grounds for which personal information processing is allowed. This includes things like obtaining consent, contractual performance, and public interest, all of which are also in the GDPR. However, one notable difference is that the PIPL does not have legitimate interests as a processing ground, which is a fairly popular processing ground under GDPR. Another area of similarity is data subject rights. So the right to ask a company what information they hold about you, the right to have personal information corrected if it's incorrect, and the right to be forgotten or erased. And lastly, the PIPL also has quite significant penalties if its provisions are infringed, which in the case of PIPL is up to 50 million RMB or 5% of annual revenue. And so some of the differences, in fact, include things like the PIPL introduces a concept called separate consent for various processing activities. So for these processing activities, you can't bundle up your consents and rely on one checkbox to obtain consent. It needs to be separate, it needs to be clear and differentiated from other consent for these various processing activities, which include things like transferring data overseas and processing sensitive personal information. Another key area of difference between the GDPR and PIPL is that the PIPL has a wider scope of sensitive personal information. It's defined quite widely and also includes financial information. And lastly, there are different mechanisms for cross-border data transfer, which I'll cover in a bit. But in summary, for privacy, people should note that the law is already in force. It came into force last November. And the good news is that there are some areas of similarity. So UK companies will be able to adjust and adapt some of their existing protocols from the UK and EU to the China market. However, it will be important to note where they diverge and to adjust your practices accordingly, including the impact of consent solicitation and redrafting privacy notices accordingly. Can we move on to the next slide, Sherry? Great, thanks very much. And so the second area I'd like to cover today is cross-border data transfer. So this has been a key area of focus for foreign companies, looking to see whether they can in fact move their data in China overseas. And so ever since the cybersecurity law came into effect in 2017, companies have been looking for clarity as to what they can do where cross-border data transfer is concerned. So today I'll cover what China's privacy law says about it, given that personal information is a very big category of of data, and the PIPL actually sets out some quite useful channels to be aware of when it comes to moving data overseas. Next slide, Sherry. Thanks. So the first channel that's referred to in the PIPL is security assessment. And this is probably the most burdensome of channels to move data overseas. But in September this year, some measures came into force regarding security assessment. Hopefully it sets out some numeric thresholds for where security assessment becomes mandatory. This includes data handlers, which handle the personal information of over 1 million people. If they transfer data abroad, a security assessment is mandatory. It also includes data handlers which seek to send the personal information of 100,000 people overseas, or the sensitive personal information of 10,000 people overseas since January 1st of the previous year. So what is helpful is that these measures do outline quite clearly these thresholds by which security assessment is mandatory. And so companies will be able to check themselves against these thresholds, and will likely include big financial services companies, major retail companies, and maybe healthcare companies as well, which handle quite a lot of personal information. The measures also dictate that for where handlers provide important data overseas, or if they're defined as critical information infrastructure operators, security assessment will also be mandatory. The scope of these two concepts aren't exactly clear at the moment. I will just say two things about them. One is that they have a connection to national security. So important data is considered, broadly speaking, data which may have an impact or may compromise national security. And it's the same with CIIOs, that they are defined on their sort of proximity to whether, if they're compromised, national security may be affected. So it's clear at this stage that the majority of UK companies are unlikely to be considered CIIO, but the parameters for these two concepts are still emerging, and it's good to be aware of them, even though that the bulk of normal business operations will not fall into these two buckets. Next slide, Sherry. I think this was the previous slide. Yeah, if we can move on to the next one. Thanks. Yeah, that's great. And so the second channel for cross-border data transfer is the standard contract. So in June this year, China released the draft version of the standard contract. Sherry, could you go back one slide? Sorry about that. So they released the draft version of the standard contract, which is essentially a template contract between a data sender and a data recipient overseas, which basically sets out data protection obligations between those two. And for any data experts on the line, they can probably see that there's a big resemblance between this and the GDPR approach of having standard contractual clauses as a method for cross-border data transfer. So this is likely to be the most business-friendly approach, as this involves essentially signing a contract setting out data protection obligations, which must be filed with China regulators. So for those companies who don't fall within the scope of mandatory security assessment, this is likely to be a good option. Although I will just say that currently this only exists in draft form, so we should keep a lookout for what's coming down the line. We may see movement on this in the first half of 2023. Next slide, Jerry. And so the final mechanism for cross-border data transfer set out in the PIPL is certification. And in November this year, Chinese regulators released what's known as a practice guide for certification. And from what's been released so far, this is actually fairly similar to the binding corporate rules, which is another mechanism used in GDPR and is commonly used for data transfers within a group of undertakings or within a company, different branches or different regional offices in a company. I will just say that for this, the document that was released is sort of educational and for reference only. So it awaits further implementation before it becomes operational. Also, one of the standards bodies in China, TC260, have included in their legislative plan a standard for certification. So hopefully we can see some more implementation on this soon. Next slide, Sherry. Great. So that was the two areas I wanted to cover in a relative degree of detail today, and I thought it was just useful to finish on some general takeaways. So firstly, China's a fairly complex legal framework. So this includes the three laws that I mentioned at the beginning. It also includes measures which are released by individual government departments. It can also include local regulations released at the city and provincial level, as well as something called standards, some of which are binding, some of which are just recommended. But essentially all of these sources of regulation combined together and are important to be aware of when it comes to securing compliance in the China market. And aside from privacy and cross-border data transfer, there's also an emphasis on maintaining security. So maintaining security of your networks, preventing data loss, preventing data breaches and hacks, and that sort of thing, as exists in other jurisdictions as well. And so this is an important element for companies to be aware of. Thirdly, it's clear that China is now adopting a sector-specific approach to data security, which means industry departments will be releasing their own sector-specific data rules. Last year, we saw some seminal data security rules come out for the automotive industry, and we're now seeing drafts for the industry and IT sectors come out as well. So whatever industry you're operating in, it'll be important to take note of what the competent industry regulators releasing in regard to data security. And then finally, as I mentioned before, we're now sort of in the implementation phase of China's data rules. So having more detailed rules come out. And one rule that I think should be on everybody's radar is the Network Data Security Management Regulations, which was released in draft form last year and is also on the legislative plan for this upcoming year as well. So we're likely to see another draft emerge in 2023. And this regulation is actually, it's fairly long. It's 70 articles in total and covers the whole sort of ambit of data compliance, whether that's privacy, whether that's cross-border data transfer, or whether it's the treatment of data in corporate transactions, such as M&A. So this will be quite an important one to look out for and secure compliance with. So there are two quick things to mention. I think given the complexity, seek professional advice to ensure your bases are covered, as Trevor mentioned earlier. And then also just keep a lookout for new regulations consistently and to take preemptive measures based on draft regulation. Some drafts enter quite quickly into force after they've been released, sometimes only a matter of months. So it's good to see what's existing in draft form now, as this will be a pretty good indication of what future compliance requirements will look like. That's it from me. Thanks very much, and happy to take questions as well.
Okay, thanks so much, Jonathan and Sherry and Trevor. A huge amount of information there. I think we've got some time for probably we start a bit late, so I think we can allow about another 10-15 minutes for Q&A. So I don't know if Sherry, if you want to maybe stop sharing the slides, and we'll go to video view for the panelists. And if anyone has any questions, also please feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to come in with any comments. I know that we've got a couple of people on the line that are already, you know, either based in China or working in China and may have some experiences to share with the group. I do have a quick question here, which I think is for Jonathan, which is about the data rules, whether or not they apply to the whole of China equally. So do they also apply to Hong Kong and Macau? So should we just take that one to begin with?
Sure, thanks. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, good question. So the answer is no. Hong Kong operates a separate legal jurisdiction, and that's also the case for data laws and regulations. So Hong Kong has its own privacy law and its own system in regard to cross-border data transfer. So it is important to note for transfers of data from the mainland to Hong Kong, the rules that I mentioned on that will be considered moving data outside of China, and so we'll need to comply with the regulations I mentioned earlier.
Perfect. Yeah. And I think, I mean, it is a very complex area, isn't it? The data landscape, and it's changing constantly. So I guess that if people have more specific questions, they can fire you an email. And we also have sort of organised quite a few sessions specifically about the data laws in China, and I know that we'll continue to do that. I've got Jeremy Lilly from Relics is on the line, so that kind of probably segues quite neatly into that. So Jeremy, do you did you have some comments that you wanted to make?
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, can you hear me?
We can, yeah. Feel free to turn your camera. I don't know if we can. Actually, I'm not sure we can get the camera, but
yeah, no, I don't think I can. But no, thanks, Mark, for bringing me in, and thanks everyone for the presentations. Really interesting, really helpful, both sort of the kind of context setting for the last year and what's coming, and also on the data piece just now. So thank you for that. So yeah, I'm Jeremy. I'm from Relics, which is a UK global provider of information and analytics, a UK headquartered company, but very much a global company with a significant presence in China. Just on the sort of data point, I mean, as Jonathan, you pointed out really helpfully and sort of clearly, the regulatory landscape in China is really important and very complex and sort of ever evolving still, as it is in other jurisdictions as well. But the sort of one point I wanted to make, though, I suppose, is that often actually, as a British and as a foreign business, one of the biggest challenges we face is actually before the regulatory kind of challenges come into effect, which is just sort of getting your hands and getting data access in the first place, before then the sort of regulations themselves kick in. And I know this is something that CBBC and techUK both work on. But actually, yeah, I just kind of wanted to flag that as sort of one of the big challenges, is just that sort of data access point as well, which isn't something as far as I and my colleagues that are closer to this in China, that operate in China. It's not a regulatory or a legal issue of foreign companies of getting access to the data, but it's a sort of more cultural issue of sharing data with foreign businesses. So I just kind of wanted to flag that as kind of one of our kind of top priority issues really in China, and one of our kind of big market access issues. But thanks for bringing me in.
it's a good point that Jeremy makes. I mean, actually, Sherry, in your presentation, you shared some really interesting pieces of data around the kind of regional, the sort of plans for creating these different clusters in Western and different parts of China, and clearly that kind of drive across like manufacturing and other areas to digitization. It's a good question. I mean, to what extent is this, this opportunity one that's largely reserved for, local indigenous Chinese companies, these emerging tech giants that you talked about, these new Chinese tech companies? How can overseas businesses access them? I mean, are there these type of restrictions around data, or there's some red lines in terms of how UK companies can operate in China? I'm not sure if you want to speak any thoughts on that.
Sure, I can share my 2 pennies. Again, the opportunity is huge here. We always talk China in big numbers, like trillion figure, which is kind of quite amazing. But again, how much that is in for UK companies, international business remains as questions. So again, I mean, the last few years when I was working with Chinese companies, they're looking at, the Westernized partners, and they're looking at kind of technologies as, good assistants. And I think, I mean, if you look at kind of decoupling and also in terms of technology challenges Chinese company facing nowadays, that they realize, the importance of technology than ever before. And they realize, again, China won't be able to produce the whole thing. China is leading on kind of consumer tech applications. We've got massive app like, the WeChat and everything. But China also needs improvement and also support in the likes of, semiconductor, industrial software. So that's actually where the core part in the Western technologies space, where UK can provide offer. When I was sharing that kind of the value chain, you could see, international companies like Siemens, they're actually doing well in China. So again, I think I would encourage, UK companies to be more ambitious and also more, adventurous in terms of exploring Chinese market. And also that will need, by partnering with Chinese suppliers, Chinese system integrators, it won't be easy to land projects, but we are supporting that. And some of them is pointing them to the right government stakeholders in those cities, as you pointed out, Mark. And also some of them are, linking them with right system integrators or project owners. So I hope that answers part of your question. So again, is exploration stage, and the opportunities will be, goes to those people who really have long commitments for the China market, because it's not easy. It's not easy.
Yeah, and I guess it's particularly challenging given the inability to travel, because so many of these things do rely on face-to-face contact to build those partnerships and those relationships. And arguably, even some of those companies that have operations in China have found that difficult due to regional travel restrictions. But fortunately, we've seen that lifted. I know that Trevor didn't want to talk too much about politics, although he did make some interesting comments on that. There is a question that's come through from Chris, and he's asked about the US-China situation in relation to chips and semiconductors. The question really is, and maybe you can or you can't answer this question, but how do UK firms avoid getting caught in the kind of political crossfire between the two countries, given the fact that that China is a huge market for chip consumption through its kind of consumer electronics and automotive markets? So the first question is, how do UK firms avoid getting caught up in that? And secondly, do you think that this is going to spread to other areas? So do you expect to see other areas of technology being controlled in a way that may impact UK companies?
Yeah, I mean, difficult to say in terms of where it might go. I mean, the one thing I would say as far as the US is concerned, and they've been saying, I think because of COVID restrictions, they're not been able to do it. They were going to send their sort of, market lead on semiconductors and sort of national security related issues down from Beijing to give us a briefing on this. So I haven't had a detailed briefing from them exactly where they think this is going. But the one message that they've been very specific about on this, and they push quite hard on this, is that this is the US view, is that the sort of scale and the size of the market is very, very targeted, this, and that they think it only covers a very, very small bit of the market. And it's very specific as they see it in terms of what's controlled and what's not. And that provided companies aren't sort of, in that specific area, the technical sort of specifications that they've set out on that, for most companies, they should be able to still, carry on as they were. We had a separate briefing actually from the chap, the US national based here, who used to be Intel's country manager. And his view was that actually for UK potentially and European companies, this was actually a market opportunity, in the sense that a lot of the American companies, albeit that they might be able to sell their less technical and less high spec chips, etc., to China, some of them were still reluctant to do it because I think they thought they would still get caught up in something that the US were doing, and that if UK companies wanted to come in with things that are under those thresholds, that market would open up for them. So he was quite clear on that. He knows much more about the industry than I do. But I mean, so if companies have got very specific questions on this, then we're happy to take those. It's easier to deal with them one-on-one, and we look at them. Whether it goes wider than that, again, I mean, I think, I don't think I'd be able to sort of say on that, because it's very much going to be led by the US government. What I would say is obviously people, and I'm sure they are doing it if they've got interest in the Chinese market, will keep on top of the news and see what's happening, because I know there's some stuff that's been worked up in Congress, but whether that goes any further or not is very much subject to the US system. UK companies, though, will be obviously controlled not so much by the US sort of rules and regulations, but very much by our own ones. So again, if companies have got some concerns about that, either come to us direct or go through the CBBC, or even do some research on gov.uk, because there's some specific stuff. We had the link which we showed earlier on in the slides. And that won't answer all the really technical questions, but it might give companies who are a bit nervous a specification. And then I would guess my final point, which won't come as a great surprise, because I think all three of us mentioned this, is very much about making sure you've got good, sound legal advice to make sure that whatever you're doing is within the rules and regulations. So whether it's something that does require an export license, etc., make sure that you're watertight on how you take that forward. Consult your own lawyers, consult experts. There are government websites and government units. I think it's called, I haven't got access to it immediately, but it's called Spire, and I think you can actually then find out some more detail there. So there are sort of help methods there, help mechanisms. But if companies really want to follow this forward, then I think they should just get in touch with us direct. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the link that we had on the website on the slides to the digital tech microsite that contains basically it's everything in one place around risk and carrying out due diligence, etc. So that's a really good place to start, I think. Obviously also CBBC and techUK both do a lot of work with our members in this area. So if there are particular challenges that you're having with the system, we can, I suppose, to some degree help to raise and flag those issues through the right channels to make sure that the voice of business is being heard, which isn't, we shouldn't, assume that that's the case, because in many instances, policies are implemented, they're not always, taking on board the experience of business. It's important that we make sure that information flows back to the policymakers. Conscious of time, I think I've got a couple of questions from Rick Chandler, UCL. Did you want to, Rick? Do you want me to bring you in very briefly? If your microphone is turned on, just bear with me 1 second.
Yeah.
Are you there, Rick?
Okay. Yeah. Hi. Yeah, I didn't want to raise too much. I'm just working with UCL. I know we had to stop all of our inward investment from China, as did most of the other UK universities, particularly in our research and technology area. I noticed on one of Trevor's slides a delegation of 10,000, I think, coming in. I've, over the last 4 or 5 years, seen a huge decline in the inward delegations coming in for China. So really, are we losing out to Europe in any big way? I've got a feeling we are.
So I guess the question is, do we see delegations getting back on track coming in from China? And secondly, are we at a disadvantage to our European neighbours in relation to China? How do they perceive us, both in terms of inward investment and exports?
Yeah, obviously can't speak for the Europeans. I think there is a job for us to do here in terms of outreach and reconnecting with some of the big Chinese institutions. I think that particular point referred to sort of the Guangdong sort of Department of Commerce, who are sending these delegations over to Europe. So when I saw that, because it's all quite new to me, as you know, I've only been here a couple of months, but when I saw that, the one thing that occurred to me is that we need to get down and see that department, speak to them, and find out what their plans are. I think in Sherry's slide, she mentioned London Tech Week, so we're quite keen to get people over for that. So I think there is a job for us to do to sort of now travel is becoming easier again, or hopefully becoming easier again, to actually start reaching out to these people. We've still maintained the relationships with them, but it's been difficult in terms of encouraging people to travel because they've just not been willing to travel themselves. But now that's coming back on stream, and so there is a job for us to do that. Whether we're losing out to the Europeans, again, difficult for me to say. What I did in one of my slides mention was that the UK is still sort of preferred destination in Europe for Chinese FDI. So that still holds true. But as I say, there is more that we need to do on that. So we'll certainly do that. And it's not just us. I think the Netherlands has just introduced some similar controls around their National Security Act. So I think others in Europe will be doing it. Whether they're as robust as ours is for them to decide. So I think there is that risk, but equally, when the National Security and Investment Act is put forward, it's put forward for very, very good reasons, and it's worth just stressing on that it's actor agnostic. It's not, despite what the media might say, and the media always pick out China and Russia in that, but it's for any sort of investment into the UK. Although there are obvious countries of concern, as I say, and just going back to what I said about what the Prime Minister said recently about sort of robust pragmatism. I think that's the approach. Now, exactly what that means, I think we need to define that a bit on a case-by-case basis. But again, we're happy to speak to people. I know certainly it's slightly separately from that, but our science and sort of network here, Science and Innovation Network, they are doing quite a lot of work with universities here, and I know they're working on some projects, and they're looking at things where there's been some joint projects. We're looking at some stuff under the Industrial Cooperation Partnership, where we've got sort of companies and institutions who are working together as well. So there is some good stuff going on, and I hope some of it can come back to UCL. Thanks.
Yeah, well, my point was actually that it's nowhere near what it was 5 years ago. I know we're not in the golden era now. Mark and I were out in Shenzhen 2016 to deliver what President Xi and Cameron had agreed on, £1 billion program. And when we came to deliver it, they were only offered for 100K on the table, I think. The Treasury had spent it all. And if the government focus is to bar China while Europe's is not, then we are losing out de facto. I mean, that's anyhow. That's what we could talk all day about.
I think also it's important to remember that there is the strategic review is being re-reviewed at the moment, and that a more formal government strategy on China is being put together. And I think that once that's in place, it will give more clarity and direction to how the UK engages with China moving forward. We know that the last couple of years in the UK have been very difficult politically because of post-Brexit, the political landscape. And I think that, as Trevor mentioned, the language is softening. I think that there is this idea of a more pragmatic approach to China that balances trade and national security is kind of where we're headed. So I would have thought that would in the future result in a more sensible kind of approach, and really looking to grow those opportunities where they exist for the UK. I don't want to cut this off because I think the discussion is just beginning to get going, but we are running out of time. So I would like to kind of draw things to a close if possible. I'm sure that we will revisit all of this in the new year, and so very much keen to reconvene this group again as soon as we can. Actually, before I do that, I do want to quickly plug a couple of things. So I'm just going to just bear with me one moment. So we do have a couple of things coming in the new year, just to make you aware of. So any of you that are thinking about setting up in China, we do have a workshop coming at our London offices in January as part of our Navigating China series. So if that's of interest, please do sign up. We're also organising and planning a larger full-day conference in London, the UK China Business Forum, on the 15th of March. So some time out on that one. But the conference will include sessions looking at the data, cross-border data landscape, and also looking at technology as an opportunity for the UK, tech innovation and net zero. So that's already up live on the website, so you can book tickets, and also very keen to hear from companies that may be interested in joining some of our panels as speakers. So please reach out to us if that's of interest. Various other things that we've been promoting this year and next, including things like the Canton Fair. I just point you to our website really to look at what's coming next. And please reach out to us directly if you have any questions about today's session. So finally, I'd just like to wrap up by thanking all of today's speakers, Trevor, Sherry, and Jonathan. Hope Jana gets well soon, and we'll be keen to hear from any of you with any follow-up questions. We'll circulate the slides as a PDF very shortly, and also there's a recording available if anyone wants to listen back. Okay, thank you very much and have a great day. Bye.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Mark. Bye-bye.